Wonderful.
You're all set.
Okay, so a few words from me. Thank you guys all for coming, as always. I love our Thursday mornings. This week, as advertised, we're going to be talking about the power of words, and particularly political words. And I announced on Twitter, for those of you who don't follow me on Twitter, the magic trick of this episode is going to be, I couldn't find the document. I was like, oh, I'll do this, and I have this great document, and then I couldn't find the document. So, but I know it well enough. I can even quote part of it to you, so it's all going to be good, but it's kind of my magic trick for the episode. But before I launch into that, I want to turn things over briefly to my partner in crime, Matt, who will explain for the uninitiated how to tune in and ask questions after I'm done with my part of the discussion.
And thank you, Joanne. As always, if this is your first time, if you have questions, we ask that you please put them in the Q&A section. That's where we deal with all the questions during the question and answer session after Joanne gets done talking. If you have other comments or anything germane to the conversation, please feel free to put it in chat, including weather and location updates. We like to always hear where you're at and what the weather's like. That's always fun. As always, please keep it germane to the conversation and, of course, family friendly. Zoom bombers will be immediately expelled. Looking forward to a great day today, and just as my usual plug, if you do like this kind of programming, please join us at the National Council for History Education, NCHE.net, or you can follow us on social media. We put this kind of programming up, anything that's going to help under the understanding of history and the understanding of how to teach it is our goal and mission in life. So we try to provide you with the best, and hopefully you enjoy this as an example of that. With that, I'll turn it back over to Joanne, and we'll see you during the Q&A.
Okay. Okay, we're back. Oh, look, thank you. Someone just said you just renewed your membership. The NCHE, the National Council for History Education folk, are in a lot of ways wonderful. So I don't always say that, but they are. And I'll talk actually towards the end of my comments. I'll mention one of their programs that is definitely worth your knowing about. But before I do that, I want to talk about the power of words. And I'm going to say a few things that will sound obvious, but need to be said as a sort of starting point. And the first obvious yet need to say thing is, if you think about it, representative government is based on conversation. It's based on words, right? The fundamental assumption of representative government is that you put people, representatives, in some kind of chamber together, and a lot of words bounce around, and ideally you have debate and compromise, and then ideally you come up with some sort of compromise that maybe pleases no one, but that in and of itself is okay because it means everybody's partially pleased. But regardless, a democratic form of government, a representative form of government, relies on conversation, debate, words. So words, even in that basic starting point sense, obviously matter, but they really matter coming from people with power. And an example of this that's not word related, but shows you exactly the way that the founding generation was thinking about this. They were really worried immediately when the national government kicked off under the Constitution. They were worried about the example that the new national leaders would set. And they worried about what they wore. They worried about their habits. They worried about things that sound really trivial. But the reason they worried was because they assumed that the public would be watching these national leaders, and the way they dressed and the way they acted would shape how the people thought they should behave. That basically people would take their cues from the people in power. And so they were clearly, that generation was really worried about monarchical government and the government sort of slipping back into being a monarchy. So they really were sensitive to people wearing, and I've talked about this in a different sense before, right? Too much lace, or their clothing is too fine, then they're suggesting that they're aristocrats, and then the public will think they're aristocrats, and then they'll treat them like aristocrats, and then they'll become aristocrats, and then the government will fall. So the sort of grounding assumption, or one of them in the founding, was that people look to their leaders, and whether they are deliberately doing it or not, they're taking cues from their leader. In this case, I'm talking about clothing. I think you can say the same thing about language, that basically the weight of the office of an office holder adds to the weight of that person's words. And related to that, and certainly the book looming over my shoulder is an example of that, given the significance of words, they have weight, they have power, and they are sometimes also linked, therefore, with violence. And when I was preparing for this morning, the first thing that leaped into my mind, which again is one of those things that's seemingly obvious, and yet in this context, maybe somehow not. Think about dueling, right? That dueling as a practice, it is about actions, but fundamentally it's about words, right? There are certain words you can't say about another gentleman, and if you say those key words, then you're asking for a duel. Why? Because those words are seen as damaging. They can destroy a man's reputation, and this is all about men. But dueling was about keeping people from saying dangerous words by declaring them off limits, and that there would be a high penalty to pay if you uttered them. So at the base of dueling is this assumption that words have so much power that they can destroy a man, right? Reputation at this point was really considered to be a man's all and everything. So that mattered. You know, you call someone a liar, you call someone a coward, and those are two of the words, you're potentially making them not trustworthy, not leaderly in any way, not honest, not, you know, someone who can be cast out of the community because he no longer can be trusted as a member of the community. So all of that matters. So as antiquated as dueling seems, the fundamental assumption under it, that words have power, you know, precedes that and postdates that. Now, toss that understanding, toss that assumption about words into the debate over slavery in the 1850s. Okay, so regardless of anything I'm saying today, obviously, it's a fraught debate. It's a debate that lasted for decades. There were different people taking different approaches to it. There were some who were trying, you know, moral suasion, that they thought nonviolence was the way to get things done. There were people who thought ultimately, and this is in the 1850s, that violence might be necessary to provoke change. But in essence, they're debating, and particularly in Congress, the fate of slavery. It's going to be decided, obviously, by words. Now, if you think about the history of slavery debate in Congress, a lot of it is about words, right? I mean, even I was going to mention the Gag Rule. I'll come back to that in a moment, but even preceding that, right? There was the continued effort when by abolitionists early on to send abolitionist pamphlets to the South, right, to spread around that knowledge, to spread around those words, and they were banned, right? So already there was an argument just about talking about abolishing slavery, which makes sense in the South because words have power for everyone, including enslaved people. And the fear among Southern slave holders was that these sorts of, you know, flaming ideas rolling around in the South could get enslaved people into a state of revolt. So Southerners had to be really worried about words to keep their slave regime in place. So violence, it kind of becomes a language of abolitionism in a way, and that becomes more true, as I said, in the 1850s. But even before that point, think about, and we've talked about the Gag Rule, right? And even the object that week was like the draft of the Gag Rule. The Gag Rule is an attempt to stop discussion, to not allow people to talk about anti-slavery petitions, but really to stop a certain level of discussion about abolishing slavery, right? I mean, it is what it is, which is, no, we can't talk about this. And on one level, there's a logistical basicness to that. But on another level, think about that. This is a flaming problem. It's dividing the entire country. It's not like no one will know it's there if we don't talk about it in this chamber, but no, we're not going to talk about it, out of bounds. Now, that didn't work really well. And I talked about it briefly. This might have been like the second or third week of these History Matters sessions. It didn't work well because people who were presenting petitions to Congress, anti-slavery petitions, realized that their right of petition was being violated. And in the end, the most violent years in Congress and years that particularly had a lot of public uproar were the years, a couple of years before the actual Civil War and the Gag Rule years. Because people in Congress, it riled people up in Congress. People like John Quincy Adams, in a savvy kind of a way, spoke to the public and didn't say, we have the right to speak out about slavery, which he didn't necessarily know a lot of people would care about, but he knew a lot of people, regardless of what they thought of slavery, would get very upset if their right of petition was being violated. So that's the path he went down, and it had an impact, right? So, you know, the Gag Rule is just about words being allowed to be said on the floor of Congress. Okay, so this brings us to the document that I will magically talk about. I can't believe I couldn't find it, guys. You know, I've said before, I have a document brain. I remember finding it at the Library of Congress. I remember the folder it was in. I looked in the folder here that had everything that I found at that time in that folder, and it's not there. And I know it's not there because probably when I wrote about it, because it's a great document, I put it down somewhere and I may never see it again. I'm not going to turn the camera around to show you what my office looks like, but there's a lot of paper. So I tried, actually, I will say on your behalf, I took piles of paper and I went through them, but it's going to require more digging. So at any rate, it is an amazing document that still will have an impact above and beyond the fact that I couldn't allow you to see it. So let's place it in time. It's a document from July of 1856. So in May of 1856 is the caning of Charles Sumner, right? Where South Carolina Representative Preston Brooks, who feels that in a speech on the floor of the Senate that Sumner had insulted the South and had insulted South Carolina and had insulted a kinsman of Brooks. He comes into the Senate. He waits until all the women have left the room because heaven forbid he bludgeons someone when women are around. And then he goes up to Sumner, who was at his desk, actually franking copies of his speech, so labeling them so that they could be mailed out. And Brooks basically said, you've insulted me, you've insulted the South. And he canes him, violently canes him, to the point that the desks in the Senate were bolted to the ground. And Sumner, in his urgency to get out of behind his desk, pulls the desk up, the bolts up from the floor, and ultimately collapses. So, and this coming after, in and of itself, it would have been tremendously symbolic and upsetting. Coming after a string of Southern attacks on Northerners, which had happened in the months leading up to it, it was even more over the top, and it lit up the nation. It upset everyone. I mean, I actually looked through at one point Charles Sumner's papers, and I saw letters written to him by people saying things like, and when they beat you, they beat me, or I'm coming to Washington because I have to fight back for my rights. So people took this really personally for actually logical reasons, but it was huge. And Southerners too were rooting on Brooks, you know, good for you for silencing these horrible people talking about abolishing slavery. So it's a big deal. And then you get July of 1856, when the House is going to debate whether they should expel Brooks, right? So now the debate is, what do we do with Brooks? What's his fate for what he's done? So everyone knows that's going to be a fraught debate. And people are already writing. There's a little bit in my book about this document and about this moment when everyone's like, oh, like this is going to be bad. So what I found in the papers, and it's in the papers of Nathaniel Banks, who was speaker at the time. And it was from a Southerner, which I could only tell because of the content of the document. And it's addressed to Speaker Banks, and it's signed by, quote, a well-wisher, and no other indication of who writes it, but it's clear it's a Southerner. So I'm going to read you a couple sentences from it that I found. Okay. Do you know, sir, that there exists at this time an almost murderous feeling between certain members of the North and South, and that it is with some difficulty that a few peace-loving and happily influential associates can prevent demonstrations upon the floor, which in the present state of excitement would almost certainly lead to a general melee and perhaps a dozen deaths in the twinkling of an eye. Okay, so that's quite a start. And then he goes on and he says, a number of Southerners are constantly on the alert to, quote, prevent the throwing of missiles first from their side. And he asks Banks to do the same. Will you and your friends discourage people from throwing missiles at us by exploiting the crisis with words, with abusive words that would, quote, goad their opponents beyond bearing? So what this statement said, and it was wonderfully, it's one of those documents as a historian, you're digging around, I'm like, I'm interested in what's happening in Congress in the 1850s. And then you found a document, and it's from someone in Congress, in the House, and he says to the speaker, you better watch the words of your friends over there. I'm trying with my friends to watch the words over here, because if someone throws the wrong words over towards the other side in this argument, there's going to be bloodshed. The missiles, which is a wonderful word to use for it, by missiles, he means words. And at this moment, during this debate, they have that power, right? Words could, and you know, my book is partly showing the impact of certain words used in Congress in a deliberate way to cause pain or to cause intimidation or to silence people, or to stand up for rights or whatever it's being used for. It's battled by words, right? It's battle of communication, but words are the weapons. And when you look at what members of Congress are saying during these years, 1856, 1857, moving on, again and again, they're saying, please watch your words, please watch your words, which it's one of those things, it's a phrase that is so common that it's seemingly meaningless, but as a historian, when you're digging through sources, and I always do this when I'm really beginning research, when I notice a phrase or a word that appears a lot, I begin, and I'm like the last human being who uses index cards. So I was about to say, I have an index card. My next book, maybe so far it doesn't have index cards, but at any rate, with this book, I had index cards. I create an index card that is the card for that word or phrase. And every time I see that word or phrase, I stick it on the card. And in the end, in some cases, I have multiple cards stapled together showing that everybody's using it, which then means, oh, well, that's interesting. The word seemed weird to me, or it's being used to, you know, more than I would expect it to. What does that mean? When I was working on my first book, Affairs of Honor. Wow, I need more coffee, guys. When I was working on Affairs of Honor, and I was working on the election of 1800, which gets a chapter in that book, and I was digging around in papers and I was reading what people were saying, and I was trying to sense, as I do often in my work, how they were feeling at that moment. What I saw again and again was the word anarchy and the phrase civil war. And I began my index card sort of way of doing things, and I think I ended up with 3 double-sided index cards. People were talking about anarchy and civil war a lot. That is an important realization. You know, I can't say everyone was thinking about this, but what I can say is, without looking for it and just digging around randomly in a lot of sources, those words appear a lot, which suggests that they are on people's minds, and that's worth thinking about, because you would not automatically plug anarchy and civil war into your assumptions about the presidential election of 1800. So in this case, you know, the index cards as revealing that words matter, I had an index card collection of quotes from members of Congress about words, right? Words matter, watch your words, don't use those words, what words are you using? So for example, the speaker at one point stands up and says, "Let gentlemen who may choose to take part in this debate scrupulously avoid the utterance of unnecessarily harsh language." Or another congressman says, "Let us not irritate each other. Let us avoid disagreeable language to each other." Right? Watch your words. And it's not just watch your words or else it's going to be unpleasant. It's watch your words because this could result in violence. It could result in bloodshed, and it won't stay here. It won't just be in Congress. It will spread. So that, again, shows you the power of words and the power of words to provoke. The ultimate example of that is a little tiny anecdote I found. And when I was preparing for this this morning, I came across this story and realized I used to say it all the time. And I had kind of forgotten about it, which surprises me because it was one of the most powerful things I found, I think, when I was researching the field of blood. So, and it was actually, it takes place during the fuss about the caning of Sumner. And I read, Brooks stands up to defend himself. And he says all kinds of remarkable things in his comments. And one of the things he does at one point is he begins to point to or mention Northerners who he knows have guns in the house with them. You have a gun, you have a gun. So, you know, my like, boop, my antenna go up. So I began looking to see what he was saying and trying to figure it out. And I got the name of one kind of obscure member of Congress, and I began digging around, and in a newspaper database, little thing in like that little bit of the page. So it's kind of like, you know, interesting story. I found this anecdote. It says this Massachusetts representative was at the train station in Massachusetts about to head back to Washington. And let's see, this is a couple months after the Sumner caning. And he's at the train station and a group of constituents come up to him while he's waiting for the train and they give him a gift. And apparently the gift was a gun, and it was inscribed with the words "free speech." Now, every time I tell that story, it makes, like, it gives me chills. His constituents were telling him, you go back down there, you take this with you, and you fight for your right to say what you want to say. And in this case, probably particularly on the issue of slavery. You have a right, you're our representative. You have a right to speak your mind and to represent us, and we're arming you and telling you to fight to do that. Think about that, right? If you want a sort of mind-blowing example of the connection between politics and words and violence and power, it's hard to think of another one. And as I said, I stumbled across it only because, gee, thanks, Preston Brooks. He mentioned this person's name in his flaming speech in the House. And thank heavens, like there was this little tiny thing in a newspaper. So that's my larger point is the link, the close link between words and power and politics and violence. We think about it, we talk about it, we can sort of, you know, speak about it in a broad kind of a general way, but any time you're living in, and particularly this time, right, words have a real power. And when people high up use provocative words, they have a big impact. You know, at some point, maybe 2 years ago or something, I was asked to appear on BBC Newsnight. And they wanted to talk about words. They wanted to talk about presidential words. And I didn't know in advance that it was a panel. And one of the people on the panel was a member of the current administration. And that person said, well, actually, I should back it up. They went to me first because I'm the early American historian. And I said some version of what I just said here. Words have power, and the words of a president have real power. And whether you like that or not, it's a fact. The office has power, and the person in that office has added power, and his words have added power. And the person from the administration said words are just words. And when I went back to listen to this panel, I could hear myself in the background going, like they wouldn't let me back into the conversation. But right there, right, I was saying the same thing that I'm saying now, which is we need, and I've said so many times in past episodes in different ways, think about the words that are being used. Think about the ways they're being used. Think about who's using them. Think about what emotional response someone is trying to provoke in you. Take a breath before you allow yourself to respond. Think about what's happening with the words. And this is part of that same conversation. I just think it's one of those things that you take for granted in so many ways. And I think if you sit down and just think about it, you can see the power of this, and you can see how easy it is to get swept up in emotion and in a fight and in an urge to want to do something angry or even violent because of words. Even this morning, because of course I looked on Twitter before planning what I was going to say, and someone said something nasty about me, and my gut response was, why I oughta, like some part of me wanted to say something back. But I don't do that on Twitter. I'm not about that. And so I actually did the take a breath, take 2 breaths, and I didn't do it. And I was glad I didn't do it. But, even with me preaching here week after week, how important it is to think about words, I almost got swept up into a moment of stupidity. So I'm preaching it because it matters. Words really matter, and they matter almost more today than they have in quite some time, because the nation is so polarized, and because words are encouraging more of that polarization and labels, and dangerous words. If you refer to people as vermin, that's a problem. That's dehumanization. That's a dangerous word. It's not liar, it's not coward, it's a dangerous word. So I suppose all of this is a way of urging you once again, with a different historical story, to really think about the words that people are using, and to think about your words too. What do you mean to say? And what do you need to say it? And granted, sometimes, hard words are hard words. And I understand that. I just want us all to think before we deploy. We can't all, this is not a moment when everyone can sit back and be perfectly, absolutely, always polite. This is a fraught moment, and there's a lot at stake. But we shouldn't plunge into that blindly, thoughtlessly. We need to think about what we're doing. We need to think about what we're saying, because it matters. It matters a lot. And that's maybe one running thread of all of these conversations every Thursday morning. What we're doing now matters a lot. I just sent off today an op-ed, which I haven't heard back on, so I don't know if it's good or not, but that's one of the points that it talks about. If it gets published, I will let you know about it. Okay, I know it's my time to stop. I do want to mention one other thing, because I mean to do this every week and I forget. But this week, when I was digging around and getting ready for this session, I stumbled across a book that is really interesting. Came out, I think, last year, so it's probably not really well known, and does an important thing. And I actually have it sitting next to me because I own it. Force and Freedom. Oop, there we go. Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence. This is really interesting. It talks about how Black abolitionists came, or some of them came, to believe that violence would be necessary for change, but also how that process happened. It talks about the link between abolitionism, words, resistance, violence in a really interesting way, and plugs into that the question of race. So I'll hold it up one more time because I think it's really interesting. It came out after my book came out, or I would have actually really been interested to read it and think about it. But and it's not an 800 page book even. So at any rate, okay. Oh, the mug. I almost forgot. Okay. Okay. So this is a family show. So I have covered up. So this is a mug that I thought I wouldn't be able to use. And I've used it, but I've edited it. And I hope that this is okay. Matt can yell at me and blank me out if it's not okay, but I think it's okay. It says, right, like a mother, boo. This is my writing mug. I use it when I write to remind myself that writing matters. So I actually found another mug. I really thought this one was off limits, and I hope, Matt, that it's okay. My little Post-it things are hiding the bad part. But words matter. Okay. Now I see people are cheering the mug. Thank you very much. I was worried. Okay. So I will now stop and open things up for questions.
Oh, I love it. I can't imagine what's about it.
I know. I can't imagine what it says. Yeah.
What could it possibly say?
I know.
Well, thank you so much. While you're forming your questions, and as usual, my threat stands, which is if you don't ask questions, I will. So you'd be stuck with my questions. So put your questions in the Q&A. We got a couple already. But before we get to the questions, I just want to quickly promo, because folks kind of trickle off just a little bit. I do want to say we're in the middle of a series of critical conversations, which are webinars about race, ethnicity, and history. We have 2 today, which are going to be unbelievable. Andrea Kolb and Maribel Santiago. Please go to www.nche.net/critical conversations to find out more and sign up. They will be fantastic. They're at 2 and 7 p.m.
My apologies, Matt. I had that written on the bottom of the notes and I forgot.
No worries. And then we do have our Equity Summit coming up August 4th through 6th, which will be panels, virtual field trips, and keynote speakers, all on the topic of equity. To have, as Joanne rightly pointed out, words matter, and we want to try to fill our space with the best words about issues that are very prescient in our society today. So yes, and Kevin Levin spoke earlier this week. He was fantastic. Candace Taylor's talk was fantastic. Our own Grace Leatherman, her talk was fantastic. LeGarrette King, also fantastic. So they're really great people, and we hope that you'll join us for some of those. So with that, I have 7 questions to get going to start with today. And folks, fill these in as you go. Francesca, did women ever duel?
Well, okay. So when you study dueling, what you get are books, particularly early books, like 19th century books about dueling. They always have like a section that's like strange duel or some such thing, you know, miscellaneous duels. And they usually include like 1 or 2 by women, but the fact that they're always in the wow, is this strange category would suggest no. And actually, at some point years ago, I found in a women's magazine from the late 18th century, like a little article, kind of, I suppose, the equivalent of an op-ed, although that wouldn't have existed in a magazine at the time. But the argument of it was, you know, men have duels where if they get in a fight with each other, they do this thing and then the fight is over. And women don't have anything like that. Like, we can't settle things so cleanly. Like, maybe women should duel. So generally speaking, they didn't. Doesn't mean that they didn't do all kinds of other things, but dueling, generally speaking, certainly in the United States, was a male practice. I actually can't speak with enormous authority about Europe or anywhere else in the world, so it could be really interesting things are happening elsewhere, but in the United States, not so much.
Who was, Deanna wants to know, who was the representative from Massachusetts that received the gun from his constituents?
Oh, I want to make sure I get his first name right.
And then she asks, is there a connection between the area he represented and and abolitionist support?
Well, I mean, he's from Massachusetts, so he's from the state that Sumner is from, and so even if there isn't, I don't know, I actually don't know about the people who went and handed him the gift, and they very well could have been abolitionists. Even if they weren't, the North at this point was feeling that they had been attacked by the South. So on so many levels, his name is Chauncey Knapp, K-N-A-P-P, and Brooks says something about Knapp. You have a gun or some such thing, which is what led me to go and hunt. So that is the name. It's in my book at some point. How could I not use that story? As a matter of fact, that was the story that I was so moved and startled by that when I was writing the last chapter, I was like, when is the moment to use the story? When is the moment to, like, story moment is coming, because it says so much. It says so much.
So Rabbi Beth and Carolyn both ask similar questions, and so Rabbi Beth asks about code words to imply a provocative thing, and Carolyn says, could you comment on the role of euphemisms in political debate? So this idea that there are euphemisms or code words, can you make some comments about those?
Yes. Well, so there were some words that you just knew, that if you utter them, then you're asking for a duel, right? And coward is one, liar, those are the two words. Coward and liar are the worst. The other three, I always say, have lost some of their zing. The other three are rascal, scoundrel, and puppy. and rascal and scoundrel were about your character, I suppose. Puppy is emasculating. Mm-hmm. So those words you really never wanted to toss around very much at all. There were all kinds of ways that people used coded language and coded words, or actually, here's a Hamilton example. He and James Monroe almost fought a duel. And in the lead up to the confrontation that leads to the almost duel, Hamilton says to Monroe, and this is a quote, "That, as your representation, is totally false." He does not use the L word. He's really careful. He does not use the L word. And Monroe responds, "Are you saying I'm a liar, you scoundrel?" Right? Boop! Like the stakes just went hard. But, there's a case in which Hamilton was very deliberately choosing his words, which didn't work. But yeah, there were all kinds of other words that people could use, and the implications were clear. And then the question was, how would they be taken? If you think about parliamentary protocol, the custom of people not addressing each other, but addressing the chair or the speaker and saying, "As my courteous colleague from the state of blah, blah says," because it's preventing people from throwing bad words at each other. It's supposed to be, cutting off an avenue for bad to happen, and things get directed to the front of the chamber. So there are all kinds of ways in which this logic is built into our political system. So, I mean, now we call them dog whistles or gaslighting. Yeah, there would have been other things that people could say. And one of the customs in a duel, if you felt insulted or someone said something and, it was dog whistly, and I wasn't sure if they were insulting me, I could write a letter. What I should do, the first step in an affair of honor is for me to write basically a form letter and send it to the person who I think said the word or wrote the word, and say, I hear that you have called me a blah. Is that true or false? Avow it or deny it. I deserve an immediate response as a gentleman. That's a letter of initiation opening an affair of honor. And when you get that letter, then if you do something stupid, there's probably going to be a duel. So that's a way for, before the duel starts, the person who's insulted can investigate the word. Did you say this? Did you mean this? Again, because it gives someone a chance to say, I didn't mean it, or I didn't say it, or however they want to tap dance their way out of that situation.
Emily asks, did anyone offer Sumner weapons before or after the caning?
Yes, and he actually, and I have an interesting story about this. He pronounced, I mean, after the caning, he was out of commission for quite some time. But he said on principle he was not a man who would be armed. He would not arm himself. Interestingly, during the committee investigation of the caning, the committee, or part of the committee, they don't have a joint decision, but part of the committee says Brooks didn't warn Sumner or his friends in advance that he was going to do this. And if he had warned him that he was going to be on the lookout, Sumner would have had a chance to arm himself. And because he didn't warn him, we're condemning him. Think about that, right? Well, the right thing to do would have been to tell him that he would get physically confronted so he would have a chance to arm himself. The story that I just thought of is a similar moment. It's 1860 and Sumner's back in Congress, and he's making up for lost time and standing up for his principles and condemning the South. He gives a speech called The Barbarism of Slavery, so he's not shy. And in the Field of Blood, and I found it in the diary of the character who's kind of the main character, Benjamin Brown French, apparently some people broke into Sumner's room where he lived and seemingly threatened him in some way and ran out. And a bunch of friends came to stay with him and he was upset. And what people did after that point was they offered, do you want to carry a weapon? Because you're clearly now in danger. And he said, I am not a man who does that. And then he ended up being surrounded by a small group of men who my diary writer, Benjamin Brown French, talked to on the street. They said they were going to walk around wherever Sumner walked and they were armed. And they were basically going to protect him. So, the question, this is a different topic, but the question of who is armed and who isn't armed and what it means, that was part of debate in this period too. And Sumner, for speaking strong words and being a man who clearly was not going to duel, according to Southern logic, that meant he opened himself up to a beating.
Excuse me, Anissa, I hope I'm saying that correctly, asks a question, which is, in terms of the educational backgrounds of Congress in the 1850s, were they as well-versed in classical rhetoric as their counterparts in the 18th century?
You mean, you're saying it's the 19th century, are they as well-versed as the 18th?
Yes, in terms of classical rhetoric, classical education, which would be steeped in philosophy and these elements that would contribute to the conditions of political discourse.
Well, as far as the classics and the Greeks and the Romans and the principles and structures that they represented, in the early 19th century, people were still in that realm. But schooling is becoming more democratized in that period. The English language is changing in that period. Actually, on Tuesday night, I did an event with Heather Cox Richardson about oratory and leadership. And one of the things I talked about, and Lincoln, this was through Ford's Theater, and one of the things I talked about was the sort of revolution in the English language happening towards the middle of the 19th century, when people weren't dropping learned Latin quotes in what they said anymore. The English language was becoming more simplified and user-friendly and public-friendly and democratized. There's a book called Democratic Eloquence by Kenneth Camille, C-M, I think it's I-E-L, that talks about this. So, they were well-versed, but what was assumed to be the core foundation of a gentleman's education is shifting, and the fact that people in power are not necessarily gentlemen by 18th century standards is changing, so things get mixed up in the 19th century. Oh, someone just said, is the recording of that available? Yes. I probably have tweeted about it. You could probably also search Ford's Theater, Richardson Freeman, and I would guess it would appear. I'll tweet it again later. It was a great discussion.
I'd love to see it. I missed it. Melissa asks one, what I think is probably one of our better questions we've had in the I'm going to say the last 10 weeks at least. So I love this question. I think you've addressed it before, but it's worth revisiting, which is, do Do you ever want to scream at the historical people you're reading about? How do you manage that feeling?
Yes. Short answer, yes. I do. Well, so, you know, I sometimes I want to scream at them. Sometimes I literally have to put down a primary source and walk away and come back. Sometimes I laugh out loud at them with disbelief. Yeah, I do. And some actions, like, outrage me. These are things that happened in, you know, in 1840, and I'm still like, are you kidding? So yeah, I get very emotionally involved. The ultimate proof of that is, so I used to have a cockatiel, and he was there for almost all of the writing of The Field of Blood. And when I would write, I would sit for hours and hours and hours at my desk, and it would be really quiet. And he was a well-behaved little bird, and he would usually, actually every 45 minutes or so, he'd scream, so I would come play with him. But other than that, he was well-behaved. But I would be working in primary sources, and I would find something irritating or unbelievably stupid, and I would laugh out loud, and he became trained. I would laugh, and he would go, ah! So my bird was laughing at the stupidity. It was like, that made me beyond happy. So yeah, I do very much get emotionally engaged, but you know, I've talked about this before. The emotional engagement is part of my process and is part of the evidence. So that's not as silly as it feels sometimes. I value that as evidence, to think about, you know, why I'm having that response and how that differs from the response of people. You know, if you look at affairs of honor, each chapter starts with a person, a document, and an emotion. That's the starting point. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, the shorter answer I'll go back to, yes, I do.
Let's see. Kevin asks, the governor's oath for Kentucky includes a line for the governor to say that makes him refuse to participate in a duel, including being a second. Do you know of any other states that mention dueling in their oaths of office? And so, and I could reframe that if you need to, but let's start with.
No, as far as dueling and oaths of office, there were a number of different ways in which different states tried to deal with the problem of dueling in the 19th century. There are a lot of sermons, and the message of the sermons is don't vote for duelists. So the assumption, first of all, is that it's politicians who are doing it all the time to impress the public, but don't vote for them. There are laws or put into state constitutions or in oaths. There are any number of different ways that states attempted to prevent people taking oaths in power from engaging in this kind of behavior. The problem is not everybody obeyed those rules. And also, when an elite person engaged in this kind of behavior, not always, but frequently, no one wanted to bring the law in against them. You know, they were accused because they were the political elite, and this was allowed. You know, a great example of this to me, and an unbelievable one, is after the Burr-Hamilton duel, a bunch of Republican, I think it must be representatives, Republican congressmen, create a petition, and Burr was being brought up on charges in New York and New Jersey, and these Republican congressmen make a petition that basically says, why is he being brought up on charges at all? We never charge people with this. Like, we don't charge politicians with crimes when they engage in dueling, no matter what happens. You know, the congressmen are arguing this. So the rules are one thing, and the reality of enforcing them is another, and words matter, and so does enforcement.
I'm gonna ask, Melissa had a couple questions in here, which I really enjoyed. So, were women impressed by dueling, or did they roll their eyes? Do you have any sense of that?
What women felt about dueling?
Yeah.
Well, I think they felt a couple of things. Men were not supposed to allow women to know about a duel in advance, the assumption being that they would get in the way and prevent it. There's a duel in the late 1790s when one person says, my wife is becoming alarmed at the messages that are coming, you know, the exchanges of letters in the duel, my wife basically is figuring this out, and the other person responds and says, I should think you'd be able to control your wife, and I should think you wouldn't let her know about this, right? So off bounds. Sometimes women would intervene in some way or another. Sometimes women, not deliberately, caused a duel by expressing contempt or being upset by something someone had said about someone. And if you were the man who had been insulted and a woman said, you know, that what a horrible thing to say, that dishonors you, you're kind of stuck. The duel that ended up killing Hamilton's son, Philip, happened, George Eaker was in a theater box, and apparently there were women there. And part of the problem of that exchange was that Philip Hamilton and Eaker began exchanging words, and women saw it. So Eaker couldn't just, by Eaker's logic and by dueling logic, walk away and say, yeah, whatever. Like, a woman had witnessed dishonor, and that mattered.
That was not okay.
That was not okay. Yeah.
Jennifer asks, we're trying to get through 2 more questions, but we'll get this one at least, and we'll see where we're at in time.
Before you do that, Melissa wants to know the book. Are you talking about Democratic Eloquence by Kenneth Camille? I'm guessing that's what you're talking about. Okay, I'm sorry, go on.
Democratic Eloquence by Kenneth Camille. Yes, it is. Jennifer asks, was the Southern violence towards the Northern congressmen used as evidence to support the fear of a growing slaveocracy?
Wait, repeat that again.
So in other words, the Southern violence towards Northern congressmen, and she's referring, I think, to Sumner, the caning of Sumner and other incidents that were going on at the time, you know, in the 1850s. Was that used as evidence by, I think she's asking, Northerners to support this growing fear that slave-holding states are going to want to take over?
Oh, sure.
Generally the United States.
Oh, sure. I mean, not the Southern violence and threats in Congress was used repeatedly, particularly by abolitionists who, like Sumner, his speech, the barbarism of the South. It was barbarity. It was barbarity being performed before the American public. And some of them, like Joshua Giddings of Ohio, who apparently he was a big man physically, and an abolitionist, and his way of dealing with Southerners and the violence. In my book, I call him an abolitionist toreador, because he would say deliberately provocative things, knowing that a Southerner was going to rush at him like a crazy person. And he would then step out of the way and essentially say to the public, ladies and gentlemen, I give you the slave power. So, you know, yes. And actually, the barbarism of slavery is the name of the Sumner's talk. If you go and find that, you'll see him explicitly making that connection. As a matter of fact, in that, when I was writing the book, and early on, I was digging around making connections, and I read the barbarism of slavery speech that Sumner gives. And in that speech, there's a section on violence by Southern congressmen. And he marches his way through a series of violent events in Congress. And my chapters almost lined up exactly. Right? And I was like, I'm on target. Excellent. But anyway, again, I'm giving you guys long answers. The short answer is like, yeah, people made that connection for sure.
All right, it is 10:59. Do you want to do one more?
Do one more.
Or do we want to end it now and resolve these during any after party that happens?
Maybe we should have that after party, since it's been a full hour.
Good. Yeah,
and if you are new, the after party is that we no longer record what we're saying. and we discuss things. So yes. The after party is always fun, as is the party. So you're welcome to stay around.
All right, well, I will let you close it out. Let me just end by saying thank you, everybody, for coming. And again, please check us out at nche.net. We have some great conversations and this important summit coming up. And I hope you enjoyed our programming today. I will turn it over to Joanne to end for the day, and then we will call it a day.
Okay, well, as I always say, thank you all for coming. I think the more we can come together and have conversations about history and its implications, past and present, the better. I'm biased because I'm a historian, but I appreciate the fact that we do this every week, and I appreciate the fact that NCHE supports it and organizes and sponsors it. I never know ahead of time what I'll talk about next week, but ideally I will have found the document before we have the session. But thank you all for coming, and I hope I see a bunch of you next week.
Thanks, everybody.